A family thought. This 1870 portrait showed equality, but look closely at the boy's collar. Marcus Johnson stood in the receiving area of the Philadelphia Museum of African American History, carefully unwrapping the layers of acid-free tissue paper that protected the framed photograph. Outside, the March wind rattled the windows of the century-old building, but inside, the climate-controlled room maintained its steady temperature. His hands, practiced from years of handling historical artifacts, moved with deliberate precision. The donor, an elderly woman named Patricia Hamilton, watched him with anticipation. She had called 3 weeks earlier, insisting she had something important to contribute to the museum's collection. Patricia was in her late 70s, her silver hair pulled back neatly, wearing a wool coat that seemed too warm for the season. She clutched her leather purse against her chest as if it contained something precious. "My great-great-grandfather is the boy on the left," Patricia said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "Thomas Hamilton. The family has treasured this photograph for 5 generations. We always believed it represented something extraordinary for 1870. Marcus nodded, finally lifting the frame free from its protective wrapping. The photograph was mounted in an ornate Victorian frame, the wood still remarkably preserved despite its age. The image itself was a carte de visite, a popular format in the 1870s, measuring roughly 4 by 2.5 inches. The sepia tones had faded somewhat, but the image remained clear and detailed. 2 boys, both appearing to be around 10 years old, stood side by side in what was clearly a professional photographer's studio. A painted backdrop depicted a generic pastoral scene with trees and clouds. Both children wore formal attire, dark jackets, white shirts with collars, and dark trousers. Their faces were serious, as was typical for photographs of that era, when subjects had to remain still for extended exposure times. The boy on the left was white, with light-colored hair parted neatly to the side. The boy on the right was black, with close-cropped hair and features that suggested West African ancestry. What struck Marcus immediately was their positioning. They stood at exactly the same height, their shoulders nearly touching, neither one positioned behind or subordinate to the other. In an era when photography itself was often used to reinforce racial hierarchies and social divisions, this composition was genuinely unusual. "The family story," Patricia continued, settling into the chair Marcus offered her, "is that Thomas and Samuel were genuine friends. Not master and servant, not benefactor and dependent, but real friends. They played together, studied together, even appeared in church together. My family has always been proud of this. We saw it as evidence that our ancestors were progressive, that they believed in equality when so few did." Marcus studied the photograph more closely, his trained eye taking in every detail. The studio appeared to be well appointed, suggesting the photographer was established and respected. The lighting was professional, casting even illumination across both subjects. There were no obvious signs of retouching or manipulation, which was sometimes done in that era to alter appearances. "Do you know anything about Samuel?" Marcus asked, setting the frame carefully on the examination table. "His full name, his family, what happened to him?" Patricia's expression shifted, becoming slightly uncertain. "That's the frustrating part. The family records mention him only as Samuel, or sometimes young Samuel. There's no last name in any of the letters or diary entries we have. My grandfather used to say that was simply how people referred to children back then, by their first names only, but I've always wondered if there was more to the story." Marcus pulled out his magnifying loupe and began examining the photograph under the bright LED examination light. The surface showed the expected signs of age: slight fading, minor creasing at the edges, a few spots where the albumin coating had deteriorated, but the image itself was remarkably well preserved, protected by the glass in the frame and apparently stored carefully over the decades. As Marcus moved the magnifying glass slowly across the image, he noted the typical details of 1870s portraiture: the stiffness of the poses, the painted backdrop, the photographer's mark barely visible in the lower right corner. He could make out the name: J. Morrison, photographer, Philadelphia, PA. That was useful information. Morrison was a known photographer in the city during that period, which meant there might be studio records or advertisements that could provide additional context. Then his attention focused on the boys' clothing. Both wore similar dark jackets, likely wool and white shirts underneath. The fabric appeared to be of comparable quality, which aligned with Patricia's family narrative of equality and friendship. But as Marcus examined the collars more closely, something caught his attention. He leaned in further, adjusting the light to reduce glare from the glass. The white boy's collar was simple, starched and crisp with no ornamentation, standard for the period. But the black boy's collar, while similar in style and apparently equal in quality, had something additional. At first, Marcus thought it might be a shadows or a defect in the photographic plate. He adjusted his position, changing the angle of the light, squinting to see more clearly. There, embroidered or perhaps sewn into the fabric of the collar itself, was a small symbol. It was partially obscured by the way the collar folded, and the sepia tone of the photograph made it difficult to distinguish from the fabric itself. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. He had seen variations of this symbol before in his doctoral research on post-emancipation labor systems. It was a mark, a small cross within a circle, no larger than a shirt button. This particular design was used in Pennsylvania and neighboring states during the Reconstruction era. Marcus's mind immediately went to the darkest possibilities. After the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865, numerous legal mechanisms emerged to maintain control over black labor. Apprenticeship laws, vagrancy statutes, and binding agreements often reduced freed people, especially children, to conditions barely distinguishable from slavery. Some employers and institutions marked the clothing of black children under such arrangements. The marks varied by region and purpose: identification for runaways, indicators of legal binding, symbols of institutional control. The cross-within circle design Marcus was looking at had been documented in several Philadelphia area archives, associated with post-war apprenticeship contracts. Marcus straightened up, his stomach tightening. If this symbol meant what he suspected, then the family narrative of friendship and equality might be built on a foundation of profound inequality. Samuel might not have been Thomas's friend by choice, but by legal compulsion. The photograph, far from being a testament to progressive values, might actually document a system of exploitation disguised as benevolence. He looked at Patricia, who was waiting patiently, her hands folded in her lap. She had come here with pride in her family's history, believing she was donating evidence of racial progressivism in a deeply racist era. Marcus would need to handle this delicately. "Mrs. Hamilton," Marcus said carefully, "I'd like to accept this donation for the museum's collection. But I think there's more to this photograph than your family realized. I've noticed some details that require further investigation. Would you be willing to let me conduct a thorough historical investigation into both Thomas and Samuel?" Patricia looked surprised, but nodded eagerly. "Of course. That's exactly what I hoped would happen. I want to know the truth, whatever it is. These boys deserve to have their full story told." Marcus appreciated her openness, though he wondered if she truly understood what she was authorizing. Historical truth could be uncomfortable, especially when it complicated cherished family narratives. But that discomfort was necessary. Without it, history remained sanitized and incomplete. Marcus spent the rest of that afternoon carefully documenting the photograph. He created high-resolution digital scans from multiple angles, capturing every detail under various lighting conditions. The symbol on Samuel's collar became even more visible under raking light, which cast shadows that emphasized the texture of the embroidery. He photographed it extensively, knowing he would need clear evidence when he began consulting with other historians and textile experts. After Patricia left promising to send any family documents that might help with the investigation, Marcus sat alone in his office, staring at the image on his computer screen. The two boys looked back at him across a century and a half, their expressions solemn and unreadable. What had they been thinking as they stood before the camera? Had they wanted to be there? Had they chosen to stand together, or had someone arranged them that way? Marcus opened his research database and began with the most basic search: census records for Philadelphia in 1870. The federal census that year had been the first to record formerly enslaved people by their full names, rather than as property. It was a monumental shift in American record-keeping, though the reality it documented was far more complex than simple freedom. He searched for Thomas Hamilton first, knowing that would be easier to locate than Samuel without a last name. Within minutes, he found a promising entry: Thomas Hamilton, age 10, living at an address on Spruce Street in central Philadelphia. The household was headed by Jonathan Hamilton, age 38, occupation listed as merchant, and his wife Elizabeth, age 35. There were 3 other children listed: Margaret, age 14, Catherine, age 8, and an infant named Robert. The address was in a prosperous neighborhood, which aligned with the quality of the photograph and the family's ability to afford professional portraiture. Jonathan Hamilton's occupation as a merchant suggested significant wealth. Marcus made note of the exact address and moved on to property records. The 1870 property registry showed that Jonathan Hamilton owned the residence outright, valued at $8,500, a substantial sum for that time. He also owned a commercial property on Market Street, listed as a dry goods warehouse. The family was clearly well established and financially secure. Now came the more difficult search: finding Samuel. Without a last name, Marcus had to approach this systematically. He searched the 1870 census for the Hamilton household again, this time looking at every individual listed at that address. Besides the immediate family members, there was one additional person recorded: Samuel, age 10, black, laborer. Marcus leaned closer to the screen. The census taker had listed Samuel not as a family member, but as a laborer, despite being only 10 years old. His place of birth was recorded as Virginia, which meant he had likely been enslaved before emancipation. There was no last name given, which was common for children in apprenticeship or indenture arrangements, where they were considered more as wards than as independent persons. Most tellingly, under the column for attended school, Samuel's entry was blank, while all the Hamilton children, including Thomas, were marked as attending school. The single detail contradicted the family narrative immediately. If Samuel and Thomas had studied together, as Patricia claimed, why would the census show Samuel as not attending school? Marcus pulled up Pennsylvania's apprenticeship laws from the Reconstruction era. What he found confirmed his worst suspicions. The Pennsylvania legislature had passed several laws between 1865 and 1870, allowing white families to take black children as apprentices, ostensibly to provide them with education and training. In practice, these laws were often used to bind black children to white families as unpaid labor until they reached adulthood. The laws required that apprentices be taught to read and write, but enforcement was minimal and violations rarely prosecuted. Many black children designated as apprentices received no education whatsoever, working instead as domestic servants or field hands. The arrangement was supposed to be mutually beneficial, but the power imbalance made exploitation almost inevitable. Marcus found the specific statute that concerned him most, the Act of March, 1866, which allowed county judges to bind out black children whose parents were deemed unable to support them. The judges had enormous discretion, and the standards for what constituted inability to support a child were applied far more stringently to black families than white ones. The next morning, Marcus drove to the Philadelphia City Archives, housed in a modern building that contrasted sharply with the historical documents it contained. He had called ahead, and the archivist, a meticulous woman named Dorothy Chen, had already pulled the apprenticeship records from 1865 to 1871. The boxes sat waiting for him in the research room, their contents representing thousands of lives bound by legal documents. Marcus pulled on the white cotton gloves required for handling the old papers and opened the first box. The records were organized chronologically, each apprenticeship indenture written on standard legal forms with spaces filled in by hand. The language was formulaic, almost bureaucratic in its detachment from the human consequences it described. He worked through 1865, then 1866, scanning each document for any mention of Samuel. The names blurred together, children as young as 6 or 7 bound to families for terms ranging from 8 to 15 years. Most were listed simply by first name and race. The stated purposes were always benevolent, to provide education, training, and moral guidance. The reality, Marcus knew, was often quite different. In the records from March 1867, he found what he was looking for. The document was labeled Indenture of Apprenticeship and dated March 15, 1867. It read, Samuel, a colored male child of approximately 7 years of age, orphaned, is hereby bound as an apprentice to Jonathan Hamilton, merchant of Philadelphia, until he shall reach the age of 21 years. Marcus read the terms carefully. Jonathan Hamilton was required to provide Samuel with food, clothing, lodging, and instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic. In return, Samuel was to perform such labor and services as are appropriate to his age and capacity. At the end of the apprenticeship, Hamilton was to provide Samuel with 2 suits of clothes, one appropriate for Sunday wear. The document was signed by Judge William Preston of the Philadelphia County Court, Jonathan Hamilton, and witnessed by 2 men whose signatures were barely legible. There was no signature from Samuel, which was standard for child apprenticeships, and no mention of any parents or guardians giving consent. He was simply declared an orphan and bound accordingly. Marcus photographed the document carefully, capturing every detail. Then he searched for any related records, court proceedings, petitions, or subsequent modifications. What he found was a brief notation in Judge Preston's docket book from the same date. Negro boy Samuel, formerly property of Robert Fletcher, deceased of Richmond, Virginia. No living relations found, bound to J. Hamilton per Act of 1866. The phrase, formerly property of, struck Marcus like a physical blow. Samuel had been enslaved, likely separated from his family during the chaos of the Civil War or its immediate aftermath. His enslaver, Robert Fletcher, had died, and somehow Samuel had ended up in Philadelphia, where the legal system had quickly processed him into a new form of bondage. Marcus spent the rest of the morning searching for any additional documentation. He found references to Jonathan Hamilton in various business records and legal filings, confirming his status as a prosperous merchant. Hamilton appeared to be a respected member of the community, serving on several charitable boards and making regular donations to churches and civic organizations. There was nothing in the public record to suggest he was a cruel man. In fact, quite the opposite. Several newspaper articles mentioned his philanthropy and his service to the city. But Marcus understood that respectability and kindness on the public stage did not necessarily translate to how one treated the people under one's power in private. The photograph took on a new meaning in Marcus's mind. It had been taken in 1870, 3 years after Samuel had been bound to the Hamilton family. By that time, Thomas and Samuel would have been living in the same household for years. Had they truly been friends? Or had Samuel simply been required to be Thomas's companion, to play with him, to accompany him as part of his duties? The positioning in the photograph, which had seemed so progressive, might actually have been Jonathan Hamilton's way of demonstrating his own enlightened attitudes. Look, the photograph seemed to say, I treat this apprenticed child almost as well as my own son. But almost was the operative word, and the symbol on Samuel's collar told a different story, one of marking and control. Marcus's next stop was the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which maintained extensive collections of Philadelphia business records and city directories. He wanted to learn more about J. Morrison, the photographer who had created the portrait. Sometimes, photographers kept detailed records of their sittings, including who had commissioned the photographs and under what circumstances. The Society's reading room was quiet, filled with researchers, hunched over old documents and microfilm readers. Marcus requested the business records for photographers operating in Philadelphia during the 1860s and 1870s. After a short wait, a cart arrived with several boxes and bound volumes. He found James Morrison's business records in the third box. Morrison had operated a studio on Chestnut Street from 1863 until his death in 1891. He had been a successful photographer, serving Philadelphia's middle and upper classes, and his records were meticulously maintained. Each entry in his appointment book included the client's name, the date, the type of photograph requested, and the price charged. Marcus paged through the 1870 volume, running his finger down the entries for each month. In June, he found it. Hamilton, J. Portrait. 2 subjects. Carte de visite format. 6 copies. $3.50. Paid in full. The notation was brief, but revealing. Jonathan Hamilton had commissioned and paid for the photograph. 6 copies had been made, suggesting he intended to distribute them to family members or perhaps use them for some other purpose. The price was standard for the time, not particularly expensive, but not cheap either. What struck Marcus most was the description, 2 subjects. Not family portrait or 2 sons, just 2 subjects. It was clinical, almost detached. Had Morrison noticed anything unusual about the sitting? Had he questioned why a wealthy merchant was having his son photographed alongside an apprenticed black child? Marcus searched through Morrison's correspondence files, hoping to find something more. In a folder marked 1870, Business Matters, he discovered a letter that made his heart race. It was from Jonathan Hamilton to James Morrison, dated May 28, 1870, 2 weeks before the photograph sitting. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Morrison, I wish to commission a portrait photograph of 2 boys, my son Thomas and his companion Samuel. It is my desire that they be positioned as equals in the frame, standing side by side, with neither given prominence over the other. I wish this portrait to serve as documentation of my household's Christian values and my commitment to the proper upbringing of all children under my care. I trust you will execute this commission with your usual skill and discretion. Yours faithfully, Jonathan Hamilton." Marcus read the letter 3 times, analyzing every word. Hamilton had specifically requested that the boys be photographed as equals. He wanted documentation of his values. This wasn't a spontaneous portrait of friendship. It was a carefully planned statement designed to present a particular image of the Hamilton household. The word companion was particularly loaded. In the parlance of the time, when used to describe an apprenticed or enslaved child's relationship to a white child, it often meant something closer to assigned playmate than genuine friend. Samuel's role might have been, at least in part, to provide companionship to Thomas to keep him entertained and occupied. And then there was that final phrase, proper upbringing of all children under my care. Not my children, but children under my care. Hamilton was making a distinction, acknowledging that Samuel was in his household, but not of his family. Marcus's investigation led him next to the archives of First Presbyterian Church, which the Hamilton family had attended. Patricia had mentioned that Thomas and Samuel had appeared in church together, and Marcus wanted to see what the church records might reveal about their relationship and Samuel's status within the congregation. The church's archives were maintained in the basement of the current building, which had been constructed in 1923 to replace the original structure. The archivist, an elderly volunteer named Mr. Thornton, had been working with these records for over 30 years. When Marcus explained what he was looking for, Mr. Thornton's expression grew thoughtful. "The Hamilton family, yes," he said, pulling out several ledger books. "Prominent members, very generous with their donations." He set the books on the table. "But if you're looking for records of a black child in the congregation, you'll want to look here." He opened a separate, smaller ledger. This was the register for colored members and attendees. The congregation wasn't officially segregated, but they kept separate records. Marcus felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, though he kept his expression neutral. Even in northern churches that opposed slavery, the practice of maintaining separate records for black congregants was common. It was one of the many ways that racism persisted, even among those who considered themselves progressive. He examined the ledger carefully. The entries were sparse compared to the main membership register. Most of the black congregants were listed simply by first names, with occasional notations about their employment or their connection to white church members. In the entries from 1867, shortly after Samuel would have been bound to the Hamilton family, Marcus found the listing. Samuel, colored boy, household of J. Hamilton. The same notation appeared year after year, 1868, 1869, 1870, 1871. Samuel was not listed as a member of the church, only as an attendee associated with the Hamilton household. There was no record of his baptism, confirmation, or any other sacramental event. He was present, but not truly part of the congregation. In contrast, Thomas Hamilton's baptism was recorded in the main register in 1861, and his confirmation was noted in 1875, when he would have been 15. There were also records of his participation in church youth activities and Sunday school. Samuel appeared in none of these records. Mr. Thornton watched Marcus take notes and then said quietly, "There's something else you might want to see." He retrieved another box from the shelves and pulled out a folder of correspondence. These are letters between the church's minister, Reverend Charles Whitfield, and various congregants. There are several exchanges with Mr. Hamilton about religious instruction in his household. Marcus opened the folder and found a letter from Jonathan Hamilton to Reverend Whitfield, dated September 1869. Hamilton wrote, "I seek your guidance regarding the religious education of the Negro boy in my household. While I ensure he attends Sunday services, I am uncertain whether he should receive the same doctrinal instruction as my own children. He is capable of learning, of that I have no doubt, but I wonder if his station in life requires a different form of Christian teaching, one more focused on obedience and contentment than on theological study." Reverend Whitfield's response, dated a week later, was even more revealing. "Your concern is admirable, Mr. Hamilton, and reflects your Christian conscience. I would suggest that the boy be taught the fundamental moral precepts of our faith, honesty, industry, respect for authority, but that the more complex theological matters be reserved for those whose education and station will allow them to make proper use of such knowledge. A Negro child bound as an apprentice needs to understand his duties before God and man, and to accept his place in the divine order with grace and humility." Marcus felt sick reading these words. They were delivered in the gentle language of pastoral care, but their message was clear. Samuel should be taught just enough religion to make him compliant, but not so much that he might question the social order that kept him in servitude. Marcus had been working on the investigation for nearly 3 weeks when he received an unexpected email. The subject line read, "Inquiry about Samuel, 1870, Philadelphia." His heart raced as he opened it. The sender identified herself as Dr. Claudia Warren, a retired professor of African American Studies at Temple University. She wrote, "I recently attended a lecture where you mentioned researching an 1870 photograph of 2 boys, one white and one black, with connections to apprenticeship records. I believe I may be able to help. My great-great-grandfather was a man named Samuel Freeman, who lived in Philadelphia and who, according to family oral history, had been apprenticed to a white merchant family as a child. The story passed down through our family includes details that match elements of your research. Would you be willing to meet?" Marcus responded immediately, and they arranged to meet at a coffee shop near the university the following afternoon. He arrived early, his folder of documents and photographs on the seat beside him, his mind churning with questions. If Samuel had survived his apprenticeship and built a life for himself, if he had children and grandchildren who had preserved his story, then perhaps there was more to learn than what the official records revealed. Dr. Warren arrived precisely on time. She was in her late 60s, with gray hair styled in short locks and warm brown eyes behind stylish glasses. She carried a worn leather satchel that looked like it had traveled with her through decades of academic life. "Dr. Warren," Marcus said, standing to greet her. "Thank you so much for reaching out. Please, call me Claudia," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "And thank you for your work on this. I've been hoping someone would investigate these stories properly. Our family history has always been fragmented, passed down mostly through oral tradition, with very few documents. When I heard you speak about the photograph, something clicked." They sat down, and Claudia pulled out a folder of her own. "Well, let me start with what I know. Samuel Freeman was born around 1860, we believe, in Virginia. He was enslaved as a small child, separated from his mother during the war, and ended up in Philadelphia after emancipation. He was bound as an apprentice to a merchant family whose name we don't know for certain, though my grandfather always said it was Hamilton or something similar." Marcus felt a jolt of recognition. "The family in the photograph is Hamilton, Jonathan Hamilton, a merchant." Claudia nodded slowly. "Then it's the same. Samuel served his apprenticeship until he was 21, as required by law. After that, he took the surname Freeman, which was common for formerly enslaved people choosing their own names. He worked as a porter, then later as a waiter at one of the hotels downtown. He married a woman named Ruth, and they had 6 children. My great-grandfather Daniel was the youngest." She pulled out a faded photograph from her folder. It showed an elderly black man, probably in his 70s, sitting on a porch. His face was deeply lined, his hair white, but his eyes were clear and direct, staring into the camera with what looked like quiet dignity. "This is Samuel Freeman, taken around 1935, shortly before he died," Claudia said. "He lived to be 75 years old. According to my grandfather, Samuel rarely spoke about his childhood or his time with the Hamilton family. It was too painful. But near the end of his life, he told a few stories to his children and grandchildren." Marcus leaned forward. "What did he say?" Claudia took a breath. "He said that the Hamilton family was not cruel, at least not in the ways that many white families were cruel to black children in their care. He was fed adequately, clothed, given a place to sleep in a small room off the kitchen, but he was never free. He worked from before dawn until late at night, cleaning, serving meals, running errands, and accompanying the Hamilton son Thomas wherever he went." "Accompanying him?" Marcus repeated. "As a companion." "Exactly. Samuel's job was partly to be Thomas's playmate, to keep him entertained, to lose at games when necessary, to make Thomas feel important and admired. But it wasn't friendship, not really. Samuel couldn't say no. He couldn't choose to play with other children. He couldn't have his own interests or activities. Every moment of his childhood belonged to the Hamiltons," Claudia continued, her voice quiet but steady. The thing Samuel remembered most clearly, the detail that stayed with him his entire life, was the mark on his collar. According to family history, when Samuel first arrived at the Hamilton household, he was given new clothes. All of his shirts had a small symbol embroidered on the collar, a cross inside a circle. Marcus pulled out his photographs of the 1870 portrait and showed her the enlarged image of Samuel's collar. Claudia stared at it for a long moment, then nodded. "That's it. That's the mark." Samuel told his family that Mrs. Hamilton, Jonathan's wife, had sewn those marks herself. She said it was to identify his clothing, to make sure it didn't get mixed up with Thomas's things when the laundry was done. But Samuel understood, even as a child, what it really meant. It marked him as different, as separate, as property in all but name. Marcus felt the weight of this revelation. The symbol wasn't just an identifier. It was a brand, a constant visual reminder to Samuel and to everyone who saw him that he belonged to the Hamilton household, that he was not his own person. Did the mark continue throughout his apprenticeship? Marcus asked. Claudia nodded. Until he was 21 and the indenture ended. The day he left the Hamilton household, he burned every piece of clothing he owned. My grandfather said Samuel described that moment as the first time he truly felt free, watching those marked shirts turn to ash. She pulled out another document from her folder. This is something my grandfather wrote down in the 1960s, when there was a lot of interest in recovering black family histories. He recorded several conversations he had with Samuel's oldest son, my great-uncle Marcus. You share a name, actually. In these notes, there are more details about life in the Hamilton household. Marcus read the handwritten pages carefully. According to Marcus Freeman's account, Samuel had been treated better than many apprenticed black children in Philadelphia. He wasn't beaten regularly, though he had been struck occasionally for perceived laziness or disrespect. He was given sufficient food, though he ate separately from the family and received simpler fare. He had a bed, though it was in an unheated storage room. But the psychological burden of his situation had been immense. Samuel had been required to show constant gratitude for the Hamiltons' kindness in taking him in. He had been expected to smile and appear happy, especially when guests visited or when the family appeared in public. The photograph Marcus Freeman had written had been particularly difficult for Samuel. He had been told to stand straight, to look dignified, to represent the success of the apprenticeship system. Samuel hated that photograph, Claudia said softly. My grandfather said he refused to ever have his picture taken again after he left the Hamiltons. He said the camera was a tool of white people's lies, that it could make bondage look like kindness. Marcus thought about Patricia Hamilton's family story, about how they had treasured that photograph as evidence of their ancestors' progressive values. The contrast between that narrative and Samuel's lived experience was stark and painful. Did Samuel ever see Thomas Hamilton again after his apprenticeship ended? Marcus asked. Claudia shook her head. Not according to family history. Samuel tried to disappear into Philadelphia's black community, to build a life where he wouldn't have to see any reminders of those years. He worked hard, saved money, eventually bought a small house in South Philadelphia. He raised his children to be proud and independent, to never accept anyone's claim of ownership over their labor or their bodies. She paused, then added, but my grandfather said that Samuel never forgot Thomas. He would sometimes talk about him, wondering what kind of man he had become, whether he ever understood what their relationship had really been. Samuel said that Thomas had seemed like a nice enough boy, but that he had been raised to see Samuel's servitude as natural and right. That was the real tragedy. Not cruelty, but a system so normalized that even children couldn't see its violence. Marcus knew he needed to contact Patricia Hamilton with what he had discovered. It would be a difficult conversation, one that would challenge everything her family had believed about their history, but it was necessary. Historical truth, no matter how uncomfortable, had to be faced. He called Patricia and asked if they could meet at the museum. She arrived the next afternoon, clearly curious about what Marcus had found. They sat in his office, the photograph displayed on his computer screen alongside the documents he had uncovered. Mrs. Hamilton, Marcus began carefully, I've completed my investigation into the photograph, and I've learned a great deal about both Thomas and Samuel. But I need to warn you that what I've discovered may be difficult to hear. It complicates the family story you've always known. Patricia's expression grew serious. I told you I wanted the truth. Please, go ahead. Marcus walked her through everything. The apprenticeship indenture, Samuel's legal status as a bound laborer, the church records showing his exclusion from full membership, the correspondence revealing how the Hamilton family had viewed his education and place in society. He showed her the enlarged image of the collar mark and explained its significance. Patricia listened in silence, her face growing pale. When Marcus finished, she sat quietly for several moments, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. So they weren't really friends, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel wasn't there by choice. He was forced to be Thomas's companion. That's what the evidence suggests, Marcus said gently. The Hamilton family may not have been intentionally cruel, and by the standards of their time, they may have even believed they were doing something good by taking Samuel in. But the fundamental reality was one of coercion and control. Samuel had no freedom, no choice, no ability to say no. Patricia wiped at her eyes. My whole life we've told this story. At family gatherings, we'd talk about how progressive our ancestors were, how they believed in equality when so few people did. I've shown this photograph to my children, my grandchildren. I've told them to be proud of Thomas Hamilton. You can still acknowledge the complexity, Marcus said. Historical figures were rarely all good or all bad. Your ancestors lived in a deeply racist society, and they participated in systems of exploitation, even as they may have believed they were being benevolent. Understanding that complexity is important. But the photograph, Patricia said, looking at the image on the screen. When I look at it now, knowing what I know, I can't see it the same way. Samuel's expression, I always thought he looked serious and dignified. Now I see something else. He looks trapped. Marcus had noticed this too. Once you understood the context, Samuel's expression took on a different character. The stillness that Victorian photography required became something more fraught. You could almost see the tension in his young shoulders, the careful control of his features. I met with Samuel's great-great-granddaughter, Marcus said, Dr. Claudia Warren. She shared the family's oral history about Samuel's life, including his time with the Hamilton family. Would you like to hear what she told me? Patricia nodded, and Marcus related Claudia's account. Samuel's daily labor, his required role as Thomas's companion, the marking of his clothing, and his eventual freedom at 21. He also shared Samuel's later life, his work, his marriage, his children, and his determination to build a life of dignity and independence. When he finished, Patricia was crying openly. I owe his family an apology. We've been celebrating a photograph that represented Samuel's oppression, treating it like it was something noble. Dr. Warren would like to meet you, Marcus said. If you're willing, I think it could be meaningful for both of you. The Hamilton family and the Freeman family are connected by this history, and there's value in acknowledging that connection honestly. Patricia took a deep breath and nodded. Yes, I want to meet her. And I want to do whatever I can to make sure Samuel's story is told correctly, not the sanitized version my family created. 2 weeks later, the museum hosted a small gathering in its main exhibition hall. Marcus had arranged for Patricia Hamilton and Claudia Warren to meet publicly, with several community members, historians, and journalists present. The 1870 photograph was displayed prominently, alongside the documents Marcus had uncovered and a written explanation of Samuel Freeman's life and experience. Patricia stood beside Claudia in front of the exhibit. The two women had met privately the day before, and their conversation had been emotional but healing. Now they faced the assembled guests together. I'm here today, Patricia began, her voice steady despite her obvious emotion, to correct a family story that has been told for 5 generations. My ancestors, the Hamilton family, did not treat Samuel Freeman as an equal or a friend, despite what this photograph might suggest. Samuel was an apprentice child, bound to my family by a legal system that was designed to maintain control over black children after slavery ended. He had no choice but to serve, to work, to smile when told to smile. She paused, looking at the photograph. This image, which my family has treasured as evidence of our progressive values, actually documents something very different. It shows 2 children, one free, one bound, one with a future full of choices, one whose childhood was owned by others. The mark on Samuel's collar, which we never noticed or understood, symbolized his status as property in everything but name. Claudia stepped forward. Samuel Freeman was my great-great-grandfather. He survived his apprenticeship, built a life of freedom and dignity, and raised children who knew their worth. But he carried the trauma of those years with him always. He understood that good intentions don't erase oppression, and that kindness from those in power doesn't make powerlessness acceptable. She looked at Patricia with warmth. What Mrs. Hamilton is doing today takes courage. It's not easy to confront uncomfortable truths about our ancestors, or to let go of stories that have given us pride. But this honesty is necessary. We can't move forward if we don't acknowledge where we've been. The 2 women embraced, and there was applause from the audience. Marcus watched from the side, feeling a complex mix of emotions. This wasn't a completely happy ending. The trauma Samuel had experienced couldn't be undone, and his story was just one of thousands of similar stories from that era. But there was something powerful in this moment of acknowledgement, in the willingness to face historical truth, no matter how difficult. After the formal presentations, the museum unveiled a new permanent exhibit about apprenticeship and child labor in post-Civil War Philadelphia. The 1870 photograph was the centerpiece, but it was now contextualized with Samuel's story, with information about the legal systems that had bound him, and with accounts from other families whose ancestors had experienced similar conditions. The exhibit explained the mark on Samuel's collar, displayed examples of apprenticeship indentures, and included testimony from descendants of apprenticed children. It didn't shy away from the complexity, acknowledging that some white families had genuinely tried to provide education and opportunity, while also making clear that even well-intentioned apprenticeships were fundamentally coercive arrangements that exploited black children's labor. Marcus stood beside the photograph, watching visitors examine it closely. People leaned in to see the mark on Samuel's collar, reading the explanation with expressions of surprise and discomfort. Some looked away quickly, troubled by what they were learning. Others stayed for a long time, studying every detail, trying to understand. A young black woman approached Marcus, a museum intern named Jasmine. "This is important work," she said quietly. "My own family has stories like this. Ancestors who were supposed to be free but who were trapped in systems that looked different from slavery but felt almost the same. People need to understand this history. Marcus nodded. History isn't just about what happened. It's about how we tell those stories, who gets to tell them, and whether we're willing to face uncomfortable truths. This photograph looked peaceful for over 150 years because no one looked closely enough or asked the right questions. But Samuel Freeman deserved better than to have his story erased or sanitized. As the evening drew to a close, Patricia and Claudia sat together in the exhibition hall, looking at the photograph. They had exchanged family documents and photographs, beginning the process of piecing together a more complete story of how the Hamilton and Freeman families had been connected. "What do you think they would say if they could see us now?" Patricia asked, gesturing to the two boys in the photograph. "Thomas and Samuel? Seeing their descendants together like this?" Claudia considered the question. "I think Samuel would be glad that his story is finally being told truthfully, that his experience isn't being used to make white people feel good about their ancestors. As for Thomas," she trailed off, "I hope he would be ashamed," Patricia said softly. "I hope he grew up to understand what his childhood had been built on, but maybe he didn't. Maybe he never questioned it. That's part of the tragedy, too. How systems of oppression make themselves invisible to those who benefit from them." The photograph remained on display, a testament to both suffering and survival. The two boys continued to stand side by side, frozen in 1870, their expressions solemn and their stories now finally told in full. Behind them, across the gulf of more than a century, their descendants had found a way to acknowledge the truth, and to honor the memory of a child who had been marked, bound, and exploited, but who had ultimately claimed his freedom and built a legacy of dignity and resistance. The mark on Samuel's collar, once invisible, now stood as a symbol of both historical injustice and the importance of looking closely, questioning comfortable narratives, and insisting that every person's story deserves to be told with honesty and respect.